Thank you for inviting me. And I remember Abid as one of the young architects who was in Auroville, and I connected with him again recently, and he told me that we are trying to have this seminar. Uh, it was started as a discussion panel, then seminar, and then eventually became a conclave. So I'll go over some of the work that I've done before here and also show how uh, geospatial technologies and tools can be actually used to frame come up with a good science and actually frame sound policies for planning. Okay. I studied under a very famous professor, Professor Ian McHarg at the University of Pennsylvania, and he wrote a landmark book in 1969. If you haven't read it, you should try and get a copy of it and read it. It's been 50 years this year. It's a book is called Design with Nature, published in 1969 and then reprints over the years. It's still used as a very good handbook by planners. And one of the things that he did was he actually redefined the whole profession of landscape architecture. Until then, it was more of a garden design. Our landscape architect used to come in the end of the project where this is the land remaining. Now, let's do some gardening, planting, parking, street furniture, access, and other things, So he redefined the landscape architecture profession, which actually applies to a slightly larger sites, not just the small house landscaping. But what he did was he actually told the landscape architect should come right in the beginning of the profession, beginning of the project, where you are talking about site suitability. What is the site suitable for? Where do we build? Where do you not build? And he used to actually hand draw these different layers such as geology, hydrology, soils, vegetation, biodiversity corridors, and human habitation, human impact on the human ecology, and other layers. And one of his basic message was that the shaping of land for human use ought to be based on understanding of natural processes. This is something that he said in an interview very late in his life in 1995. He passed away in 2002. And he said that, he actually tried in the Department of Landscape Architecture to get people who are working in different disciplines, such as, anthropologists, sociologists, limnologists, and hydrologists, soil scientists. And that's what the Landscape Architecture Department was all about. And he actually had tough time finding people who would be willing to talk to each other. Scientists don't talk to each other. I don't know if you have come across this fact that the scientists don't talk to each other. They pretty much not willing to coordinate, whereas in planning, it's a very interdisciplinary field. You have to coordinate with several experts, and it's no longer a master planner who's doing the planning, but it's a team effort that goes in and a lot of scientists to come together. So it took him almost 25, 30 years to put together a team of scientists. He was the head of the department from 1955 until 1985. And after that, he still continued to teach until late in life. It's a very important message he told us that in schools we teach, we are very segmented. We are very work in silos. We don't, because that's what we are taught in school. We either become soil experts, we become hydrology experts, we become planners, we become sociologists. And that thing continues. If you look at how government departments are organized, this Department of Water Resources, Department of Environment, Forests, and so their budget's allocation is different. So there's no incentive for them to talk to each other. And that's where the whole premise of the whole basis of the problem lies in terms of planning. Okay. So just to go over a few areas, few things that I wanted to give you a little global perspective. Where do people live? People don't live everywhere. There are colder climates. Okay, I guess this pointer doesn't work on LED screens, but anyhow, so you can see very clearly that where do people live? The most dense areas, India, China. Then there are certain areas in Africa and South America. It's very clear where people live, and that is largely based on what kind of habitat is there in the world. There are deserts, there are cold climates, there are grasslands, there are mountain landscapes, and that's where it links very directly where people live, and that's how traditionally it was. Now with the technology and with the air conditioning and with all kinds of other things, we are able to live anywhere and everywhere, and that also adds to our complexity of the problems. There was one statistics I read a few weeks ago, was that there are more people alive in this world than the people who have died since the humanity began 75,000 years ago. Since the human beings came on the planet, and the number of people who died over the years, more people are living in the world today. So actually, that population map explains a whole lot of number of people that we've gone up. Our last population doubled in 42 years. Before that, it doubled in 127 years. So our doubling of population is going up. You know, we are more healthcare, more better lifestyle, better things in better technology has made our life much more, given a longevity. And what happens with to the planet then? Where do we have human influence on the landscapes? All the red areas that you see are very largely human impacted landscapes. Again, this links to the population, it links to the major habitat types of the world, and that's where we have been living. And just to tell you and show you an example of what human beings can do, this is Las Vegas. Anybody heard of Las Vegas? Very popular city, gambling place in the US in the middle of a desert. That's how it was in 1973. And it started as a small settlement, and this is what it looked like in 2000. And then what you see is there is a animation of how the city grew over the last years. There's a lake that came up, which is Lake Powell on the Colorado River, and that's how the city expanded. There was a news item came up in 2000, I think it was in 2001, which I read in LA Times, was that one lady was actually complaining that they were trying to do water conservation, and the lady was watering her lawn in Las Vegas at 12 in the afternoon, at 12 noon. And the policeman was walking by. He said that, evaporation is maximum at 12, so please don't water there. You can do it in the morning or evening. That lady actually got angry at the policeman and said, if you put these kind of restrictions, you will convert this place into a desert, without realizing that she was actually living in a desert. That's how we get disconnected with our place where we live. And that is very, very dangerous for us. If we don't know where we are living and what the ecosystem is like around us, it can actually lead you in the wrong directions and lead you into wrong policies. This is another example. I'm showing you examples where these examples are irreversible. This is the RLC, the fourth largest lake before 1960, freshwater lake. And it was that boat that you see is now 70 miles away from the coastline where it was. It was a fishing village. And so what happened, it was fed by two rivers from the Hindu Kush Mountains. It's at the border of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And it was fed by two rivers from Hindu Kush Mountain called Amur Darya and Sir Darya. Over the years, they discovered that this place is perfect for growing cotton. So they started growing extensive cotton along there. They dammed the rivers, the inflow of the water stopped, and the massive agriculture started happening over there. This is what happened a few years later, and then the lake started shrinking further, and this is what it looked like in 2004. So how much of lake has disappeared? That fishing boat that you see was a fishing village, but now it was 70 miles away, stuck in the boat. Al Gore, the former US vice president and a journalist who started his career as a journalist, he covered this place first time in 60s and 70s when he was a young environmental journalist. And if you read his book, Earth in Balance, it starts off with a case study of RLC. This is an example of how human beings can actually do to landscape. I don't know if you've seen the movie called Avatar, which came up about 10, 12 years ago. That showed actually how much destruction human beings can do. It gives you a future glimpse of destruction that people can do and want to do, and what for resources. And so let's come back to a little bit to our place where we are. So this is the map of global biodiversity hotspots, basically where majority of the 50% of the world's endemic species live there. Sorry, not endemic. 50% of world's species live in these areas. There are estimated to be anywhere between 12 million to 25 million species in the world, out of which we know only about 1.5 million species, and which have been studied. And based on that, this hotspot maps was created by Conservation International and British ecologist Norman Myers in late 90s and early 2000. They worked on it. And this shows different areas of biodiversity hotspots. And you can see the Western Ghats, although it's a very narrow strip over there in that black circle, it shows the extent of the Western Ghats. It's about 1,600 kilometers long, and I'll show you what that looks like. There was also a study done by World Wildlife Fund, and I was part of this study, where we actually documented all the different ecoregions of the world, marine, terrestrial, and freshwater, because species live everywhere. And we picked 200 high priority ecoregions that need conservation. And Western Ghats again came up in that, and it has earlier hills in the eastern hills and the Himalayan landscapes are part of this high priority ecoregions. And Western Ghats is, sorry, this image is a little low resolution, but southern Western Ghats, where Kerala is, came up as a very high priority ecoregion to be for conservation. For terrestrial and for the freshwater, you can see that blue line that goes all around it. That's the freshwater ecoregion. It's very, very important for bioconservation. This is what shows the map of the different river basins in the country. There is a watershed concept is something that we all need to understand, where water flows, where it falls, how it goes from one place to other place. You cannot say that we have too much water falling in that area, so let's bring that water here. You know, it's not possible. Country is not flat. No landscape is ever flat. You cannot actually transport water so easily. It has to be captured where it falls. And that's why to understand the watershed boundaries, it's very, very important. It's also called catchment areas, and other terms are used for that. That's a picture of Tal Kaveri in Coorg, which is the origin of Kaveri River. And you can see the watershed of Kaveri River. It goes all the way from here and it goes down. So that's Kaveri River. This is the extent of Western Ghats. I've taken this from the Madhav Gadgil report, Western Ghats Expert Ecology Panel that he was heading in early 2011. They submitted the report in 2 years later, 2013. And it was very highly debated. I've highlighted Coorg in this because that's a Coorg district that is highlighted because that was my PhD study area. I did most of my PhD work over there. And so it is 1,600 kilometers long from southern tip of Gujarat all the way to Kanyakumari, Nagarkoil. It's about 1,600 kilometers long and an average of 100 kilometers wide. It also has a different definition. There are different people have different definitions, but this was based on several ecological constraints put together, like the elevation, the species, the distribution, the biodiversity, and other things. And this is this is what the global hotspot I was talking about earlier. So what are the main issues that actually start happening when you look at these things? Regional planning is not integrating of all geographies. I said everybody works in their own departments, water resources do their own thing. So they're not integrating of all geographies. And it's very important that we actually do analysis of the hydrological modeling, transportation planning, the socioeconomic planning, but also look at how they interact with each other. What happens when you start building roads, cutting watersheds? What happens to the water flow? So interacting of these geographies is also very important. So geodesign is a very new emerging field, which is a field that integrates geography and design, and that's a new emerging field. It's not really a new field as such, but it's more of a process that people are trying to promote. Professor Karl Steinitz from Harvard University, who was heading the landscape architecture program for many years, he's now at University College in London. He's been heading that new design approach, and it brings in a lot of these data that GIS and mapping can do, and I'll talk more about it. And there is also another big data. Once I remember one of his interviews, Professor Steinitz said, I told him that there are areas where there is no data. He said, no, there's no place in the world where there's no data. If there's no data on the maps, doesn't mean there's no data. It's in people's mind. So there's traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, which is there for people, with the people, by their relationship to the geographies where they've lived in for years and centuries and generations. And so there is no place in the world where there's no data. We just have to go and find it. And local communities are stakeholders. They have to be the partners in this whole process, not just a map made or planning done and then put in front of them to give comments. That's not the process to go. And I think Sandeep will talk more about this, communities, participations, and all those things. And all those things eventually brings the science and the local knowledge and into a planning process. So there is one success story in the Western Ghats, which is the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. It is just part of, so Madhav Gadgil and several people at the Indian Institute of Science at Center for Ecological Sciences put together this proposal, and it took them many years to make a network of protected areas and wildlife sanctuaries, bird sanctuaries to put together, as it supports large megafauna, like tigers and elephants and Nilgiri tahr, which is very found few places in the world, and also the bison, and of course the most high-profile species, the lion-tailed macaque that you see over here. That's the land. That's like a flagship species. endemic only in the Western Ghats. You can't find it anywhere else in the world. So they put together this whole network of conservation, success story of conservation in Western Ghats. And now it's been, several of these areas have been declared as UNESCO heritage sites. So just to go over a little bit of the forest cover, this is what the forest cover was in 1977 in Coorg and a little bit to the north. This was a study done by the French Institute and 1977, and this is what it looks like in, sorry. Okay. Okay, this is the forest cover in 1977, and as you'll see, the middle part is completely gone in Coorg, and that was largely made into a coffee estates. That's where the major coffee thing happened. This is what in summary it looks like. In between is all pretty much gone, cleared up. What is not cleared up is land that is not suitable for coffee. And this is what the land cover went down in Coorg very fast in between 1977 and 1977 and 97, in just a span of 20 years. And that's generally considered to be the third migration of people from the lowland to highland and in Kerala and the Western Ghats. Again, majority of coffee is shade grown. So it's not that elephants or other species know that they are leaving a forest and entering a coffee estate because it's a shade grown coffee. It pretty much looks like any other forest area, except that it has a coffee growing underneath. And it supports, again, all these species. So this is an analysis that I did with the slopes. You can look at all these dark slopes, dark areas, sorry, the red color areas are the slopes which are greater than 25% slope, and that is where elephants don't like it. We shouldn't be going in that area. That's where we are trying to cut the roads to connect the highlands to the lowlands. That's why we want to put railway lines. In the entire Western Ghats, 1,600 kilometers long, there is only one place, there is a gap in between where you can easily cut across. You know anybody knows what the place is? Palghat Gap, yeah, somebody said, yeah, that's the only place where there's a gap and all the trains and roads go through that. And we are trying to cut through in between several of them, and that's how, that's the terrain you have to go through. And you can imagine the more you do these kind of things, the more you are going to cut across. This is the land cover map of Coorg, where you can have, you see that there's lowland coffee growing on, so lowland paddy growing in between, and then there's this large area that's coffee, which is the majority of the Coorg. Coorg produces about 40% of coffee produced in India. It's a very small district, slightly bigger than size of Goa, and it was a kingdom of its own, unique culture, unique way of food, unique lifestyle. Even the way they wear sari is a very unique way. You know, it's a very different culture and has produced some of the best army generals, General Timaya and Karyappa and other army people. They still have a very peaceful society, although they all carry guns, but it's a very peaceful society. It's a very unique place to be preserved, not just biodiversity, but culturally, but areas. This is the population density that you see. Coorg is only 5 lakhs. Somebody mentioned that Calicut is 5 lakhs. So whole district of Coorg is 5 lakhs. And had a very low growth of rate of population growth, because actually it's largely very difficult terrain to live in, but also it's a very beautiful place. So preferred by tourists, but still it is growing at a very, very slow pace. In fact, a lot of Kodavas have moved out of that place, and that's a whole different discussion why they moved out and other things. So here, this shows the little bit zoomed out area. As you can see, the population density along the coast is all Kerala, and then there is the light color that you see is all the steep slopes where very few people live, but still people live there. There are 44 million people living in the whole stretch of Western Ghats. About 5 million people are actually in the country. I'm talking about Western Ghats, but 5 million people actually live inside protected areas. There are tribals, there are people who didn't get relocated from national parks, like, all across, like Kana, Manas, Ranthambore, and Nagarhole and other national parks. And there are about 147 million people who depend on the forest for their livelihood in direct and indirect way. And that is something that we cannot ignore when you are doing planning. Their livelihood is as important as anybody else's livelihood in urban areas. We've had several acts like the Forest Rights Act and then Forest Protection Act and Biodiversity Protection Act. There are several acts that have been passed over the years, and keeping in mind these people, all the people who live there. So one thing that I wanted to talk about, and it's discussed very heavily across the country, especially when I'm working on the human-wildlife conflict, is that biodiversity today is not restricted only to protected areas. The black outline areas that you see in this map here are all the areas where these are the protected areas, but the light gray, light beige color, orange color that you see is where elephants have been spotted, and that's actually largely outside. They've gone through towns of Mysore, Hosur and other places, and they actually have their own migratory paths which have been blocked because industrial estates have been put in between. In Orissa, Chhattisgarh, these are very serious problems. And the future of conservation will depend how we learn to live with them. I remember in Coorg, there was somebody, one of the persons who told us that in the evening he can't go for evening walks because he's afraid of elephants. So I told him that in Bangalore I can't drive because 1.5 lakh people die every day in traffic accidents. So you have to learn to live, you have to learn to live with what you have in the surrounding areas, and the best is to adapt. It's a coexistence actually. And I'll come to in the end that actually what we call as coexistence is actually nature taking their place back from us. And I'll tell you that later in the future. But a little bit about GIS. I don't know how many people know about GIS, but just a couple of slides. It's an analytical way to visualize, manipulate, and analyze spatial data. All data that has a spatial component that is reference to the ground surface of the earth. When you overlay them, they all fall in the right place, and it gives you a very, very unique way of bringing all the different departments that I talked about don't talk to each other. So when you overlay the railways lines with the forest department, with the slopes, with the rivers they're crossing, and with the roads they have to cross, with the human habitation they have to cut across, it all starts to make sense. In Bihar, where we were working with Sandeep, we know that the roads are primarily responsible for the floods. All the rivers flow from north to south, and I'll show some slides on that. But the roads are going east-west, and they act as bunds, and they actually block the roads. Not enough culverts provided for that. Bihar is a very, very flat state, so that's a very different study. So anyways, it gives you a way to analyze a lot of things, and it lets you all put these layers in multiple, in the same computerized, as I mentioned Ian McHarg in the beginning. He used to do these manually. They used to draw all these layers on a tracing paper, put them under a light table like we do GT or something, when we make drawings in architecture. They used to put on a light table and try to draw the areas that are being influenced. With computers, it's getting more sophisticated, more high resolution, more specific, and more targeted areas you can go for. So this is an example of Staten Island in New York, which was hit by Hurricane Sandy in 2012. These are the different studies that he had done. This is all manual drawings done in the 60s and 70s. No GIS, no computers, and this is what different components that he studied, like geology, soils, vegetation, wind directions, groundwater, the percolation areas, all these different layers that you see on the left are the layers, and these are the kind of main things that popped out was bedrock geology, superficial geology, soil drainage, hydrology, and this was the final map on the left side that you see, that he has highlighted areas that are not urbanization areas and areas that are not suitable for urbanization. You see those dark areas. And then you look at the map on the right side, 30, 40 years later, which is areas that were affected by Hurricane Sandy. All the orange areas were affected by Sandy, and those were the areas that he had done 40 years ago to mention that those are not fit for urbanization. So you don't need computer sophisticated science to do this. You can actually do this with a lot of common sense. But as I always say in my talks, that common sense is not very common. It's a very, people don't actually use common sense. We should change that term literally. So these are the different areas that were affected and got hit and were destroyed in 2012 damages. I did some work with the World Bank on looking at the vulnerability of coastal infrastructure, like the roads and bridges, with in Orissa. These are some of the watersheds of Orissa. That yellow and green is the Mahanadi River, which is the famous lifeline of big lifeline of Orissa. Then to the left, to the right of that, the 321 is the Brahmani River, and then next to that, the pink is the Subarnarekha. These are 4 major rivers in Orissa. And Orissa gets hit by cyclone all the time. It gets, one of the things that they are starting to do is, they know that people are living there, it's impossible, relocating is a very, very lengthy process, long process. So what they're trying to do is make their evacuation systems very efficient, and that's what they're also doing in Bangladesh, because people are living, with a better weather forecasting systems, better tracking of the cyclones, the eye of the cyclones, when it will do the landfall and all those things, we can actually do predictions much earlier than actually a cyclone hits. And so they wanted to make sure that the infrastructure, the roads, bridges are intact so that people can be moved around. So this is looking at the watersheds of the same thing, and looking at the rivers flows and the outlet points where the Mahanadi River, all these red dots you see where the rivers meet the sea. And this study was looking at the rainfall. These are the 3D surface creation of high and low rainfall areas, and then how it falls in different watersheds. And eventually you come up with a map that shows you how vulnerable you are to flooding if all the rivers are flowing straight through, how much of the water will be actually accumulating in which areas and how much areas. We did a similar thing. This was for flooding. We did a similar thing for sea level rise. We did a similar thing for tidal waves and cyclones. And these are some of the maps for that. This was one of the studies that we did with Sandeep and in the Kosi floods. This was the work I had done before actually the 2008 Kosi floods. This was looking at the watershed of the Kosi River. You see that that's the India-Nepal border. That orange line you see at the bottom is the India-Nepal border. So this is only in Nepal right now, and on top is China over there. So if you look at the reference map, it's more than one third of Nepal, which is the watershed of Kosi River. It comes through, and these are smaller micro watersheds, these pink lines that you see on the maps, on this map here. And eventually all this water from these areas comes down to this point, and that's where it enters India. So here we have a case of heavy rainfall areas, snowpacks melting, coming through a very large area at a very steep slope, which is, so water is flowing at a very high speed because of gravity, and it enters India at a very narrow point here, right here at the bottom. And then it hits a very flat landscape of Bihar. So what happens to water when it comes, all this becomes a bottom line, becomes like a bottleneck where it enters India, and then it hits a flat ground, it spreads. It comes up into multiple braided channels of rivers. You cannot even recognize sometimes which is the main channel. This is what happens actually in delta, but this is more like an inland delta. And this is what is happening here. And what happens when the watershed, what area that I'm showing you, is destroyed because of wood cutting or development. This is what the red areas that you see have been deforested. So all this deforestation is adding up the flow of the water, less percolation, carrying more silt, and it's all coming in from the pink area and entering into India. And so actually a Bihar flooding problem is okay. We need to do a lot more work at the bottom area in India, but we also need to do a lot more work with Nepal at an international level to make sure that these watersheds are not destructed, or the water is being, runoff is reduced, more percolation. So this was actually looking at conservation of forest plus also water security, because more percolation, more runoff that you arrest, the more water you have for your people over there. This is closer to our place, Auroville, where I come from. These are the micro watersheds. That green circle you see is the extent of Auroville. Down south is Pondicherry right here. And that's a big Kaluveli tank that we have at the north here. And then, so these orange lines that you see are micro watersheds. These are micro watersheds. And the water flows through these and eventually goes through each tank and goes finally into the lake. The one on the right side flows towards the sea. So again, you have to be understanding of global micro watersheds, like I showed you in Nepal, and then the 58 rivers that originate from Western Ghats, 6 major rivers, they all have their own watersheds. And then you also have to come down to micro watersheds to actually do planning and siting and where you want to build. This is one of the micro watersheds from this area. This micro watershed. When you zoom in, this is what we are looking at, our watershed, which is the lake in our area called Irumbai Lake. And these roads that you see are crisscrossing, they are actually cutting watersheds. They are not letting the water that falls in the C and B area to flow into the A and eventually to the lake. So what happens? It floods, basically. If you haven't provided enough right culverts and right sizing of the culverts, which is not done very well because you save money on trying to make the bridges narrower and, cutting costs. So that's what happens. And this is another case of Nagapattinam, which was affected by tsunami. This is showing the 0 to 3 meters level above meters above sea level, and what is blue actually is below sea level. So you can see that how much of this area, this is the southern part of Kaveri Delta. This is where Kaveri Delta meets the ocean. And that's another scenario that we had looked at, 0.5 meters level. When you look at Nagapattinam and Velankani and all these places, we want to really do rehabilitation. You can't really move people away from the coast, because away from the coast you go into backwaters, and that is exactly the case in Kerala. Backwaters is something needs to be preserved. It's a recharge area. It can, on the edges you can grow rice, but you cannot build over there because you may make people safe from tsunami, but you can make them vulnerable to flooding, which is again equally, and flooding happens more frequently than tsunami. This is a case study that we had done for a particular village, MGR Tittu, which the village was located right on this sandbar. You see how vulnerable that village is, but it's a fishing village. It got completely hit by tsunami. That village was relocated to this new location here, and then it got flooded. After the monsoon, 8 months after tsunami, it got flooded. And what happened, the collector of the district called us and trying to know what exactly happened, and we found out the problem was the road. And here's when you zoom in, this is what you see. This is the same MGR Tittu village here, was relocated to this place next to this village, and this road was built and was given access to this. But the point is that this is where how far the water of the tsunami came in, although they relocated that village in the tsunami area itself, but still it was away from the coast. But this road, what this road did was this road flooded the whole thing, because the road they didn't provide any bridges over there, and you can see the arrow showing how the water flows, and that's how the village got flooded. So they had to redo the roads, find openings and culverts, and do again surveys to find the exact location. I'll just, last few slides, I'll just go over this example of Bombay, how a gifted city can actually be a disaster. Bombay is that pink color is all the urban expanse that you see here. That's the airport in the here. You can see giant airports, then these are the Western and Eastern Express highways. You can see how much of concrete has been poured over there and how much other. So in the middle of Bombay city, they have these hills which have the lakes. This has like the 6-7 lakes. What you see is the Powai Lake, then Vihar Lake, and then your series of there are 6 lakes that goes all the way. And that's the area where there's RML Colony. You must have heard it was in the news recently. Then there is Sanjay Gandhi National Park, there's Borivali National Park, and on the coastal area you see these mangroves. So the runoff from these mountains used to go through a certain number of channels, and ideally you should have seen some connections in the channels if they would have kept it properly, if they have maintained those things. There is also this Mithi River that flows through. Overflow of these lakes is the Mithi River that goes over here, and that's actually was taking care of the overflow. And it used to flow through, that's a Mithi River, that's an overflow from these 2 tanks, lakes. And at this place they wanted to expand the runway, so they put the runway on top and put a small bridge underneath, which was not at all sufficient, and it flooded. So next one, they actually turned the river around when they were expanding the runway. Over there, you see that they actually turned the river around and curved it around and then took it. But what the problem was that in this area, that further down here in this area, I don't know if you can see the pointer, but this area had a huge grassland. It was a wetland area where all the water used to hold. It was important for groundwater recharge. But the whole Bandra Kurla complex is built on that wetland, and that's what happened in this area. The 2000 flooding was not a one-day thing, one-day event. It's been systematic destruction of these wetlands and water and river courses that are constantly being destroyed. So just to go a little bit about the policies, Katie talked about it, but 1950, the Constitution of India recognized only 2 tiers of governance, so center and state, and the planning and land is a state subject. So central government makes a larger policies, but largely based on those standards, state can do planning. In 73rd and 70th Amendment in 1993, they created a 3rd status, which gives the panchayats much more power, and they have to have elections, and created the third tier, which was actually mandated to create a district plan, which Katie talked about, district planning cell and planning. But since 1993, it's been 27 years, but very little has been implemented in very few states because states are not really willing to give away their power. It takes time to let go of your power to other way. Planning is still pretty much rests with the town and country planning departments in the states and in areas which are beyond municipal corporations and urban local bodies. And this is an opportunity to actually bring back those district planning committees, panchayat level planning committees. Madhav Gadgil has talked about biodiversity, district level biodiversity registers, panchayat level biodiversity registers, where you document all these things. And with technology and all, it's much better off. We can do it today even better. And the role of a planner, as I mentioned earlier, role of a planner is not really to sit and plan on a drawing board, and, but it's actually to integrate all these different fields, different areas that you are bringing it in. And that is where actually the era of master planner and all this, I think we are beyond that. We have to work with several experts, with multiple experts, with people, with local people, with indigenous knowledge. And that's more of a role of a planner. It's more like a conductor of an orchestra or a choreographer who looks at the role of planner. So just to end with it and end this, you know, biodiversity also has a mind of its own. You see those ducks, that's from the, in Worcester, England, next to Birmingham. There was a flooding a few years ago where the ducks came back and they were the only organisms you see, or the species that you see were happy in flooding. They were going through all these buildings and other things. And then there is elephants who have decided that, okay, you come and encroach on my area, so I'm going to find new ways and I'm going to go through different areas. I'm also going to change my habits, just like we are considering our grandparents, we like ice cream more, we like fast food more. They also decided that I want jackfruit, I want sugarcane, and I want all these things instead of grass. You know, everybody is evolving and we have to keep up with that. And I think that this was my first chapter of my dissertation, was that over the years we have done resource extraction from nature. We have taken wood, we have taken timber, we have also converted landscapes, destructive landscape for growing food. We have the masters of extraction. And time has come that our extraction time is over. Nature is saying, okay, you guys have done enough. Now it's going to be reverse extraction. The floods, the elephant-human conflict, the wildlife-human conflict, the diseases that are spreading because of wildlife, and epidemiologists are studying, trying to still grapple with it, are actually nature's way of telling us that, okay, you've done enough, we are not able to convince you that you've done enough. So we are coming and taking back our habitat. So this is what I would end with, that if we don't do our planning properly, nature is going to take it anyways back from us, and we are going to end up in a mess. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And specifically, I'm looking at urban flooding in this case because like I mentioned, the amount of damage and the recuperation time is much more serious in urban areas. And the urban flooding is a combination